Now the question is, why do they do it? Why do they produce this shit? Okay, that's all it is. It doesn't deserve any respect at all. Because what they're seeing is this is a threat to the way they think about the economy. They believe the market can handle everything. Now, if you say climate change is huge, well, the market can't handle that. So they just made up numbers to defend their beliefs. And the work is completely cavalier.
For the second half of our program today, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce someone whose work I have followed for years and who has been I think it's fair to say, a lonely voice.
Not totally alone.
Not totally alone, but a pioneering voice in basically puncturing the economics profession belief that climate change will have minimal impacts on our lives and on the economy. Steve Keen is a recognized economist. He's a prolific author. He's a distinguished research fellow at UCL. He's known for predicting the 2008 global financial crisis. Over 80 publications he's produced on financial instability, money creation, and many other topics. Ranked 19th in academic influence list of influential economists. He's also created the open source program Minsky and a commercial business intelligence program, Ravel. He's previously been professor of economics at Kingston University in London, the University of Western Sydney in Australia. And he will discuss today challenging the economic frameworks that fuel climate delay, concluding our event in partnership with the London Action Climate Week. Steve, I'm thrilled to introduce you. We'll all be eager to hear what you have to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you. If you read economists about climate change, the basic conclusion you make is that you get much ado about nothing. And there's a recent paper in Nature that looked like it was giving us large numbers, because that said that we're committed to a 19% reduction in income by 2050. Okay? And that sounds like a lot when you look at it. Well, it's not. It sounds scary because 19% sounds big. But you can convert that into a prediction about the decline in the rate of economic growth between now and 2050. And the prediction is that that is going to cause, that's the formula, a 0.8% per annum fall in the rate of economic growth. Now that's large, okay? It's a large reduction in the rate of growth, but it's still positive. It's still saying we're going to have economic growth going on till 2050. And when you take a look at the other predictions that economists have made, they all are a lot smaller than that prediction. So this is the biggest damage prediction any economist has made, and it says economic growth is going to fall from, say, 3% per annum to 2.2% per annum. Basically no problem. That's what they've actually convinced us to believe. Now, I know they're wrong, not because I can predict the future, but because when you look at their research, they couldn't possibly be right. They've made these numbers up, and making up is a polite way of saying what they've actually done. So by making up their own numbers, they've ended up with predictions of extremely small damages from climate change. And the most recent large-scale survey of economists now, there are 2,200 of them involved in this so-called research. And the prediction they made in the survey, which 300 of them answered, so more than 10% of the working population of economists engaged in what they call research on climate change, was that 7 degrees of warming, 7-degree increase in global average temperature would reduce GDP in 2 centuries hence, when they were told they'd be, hypothetically, when we hit 7 degrees of warming. That would reduce global GDP by 25%. Now, when you convert that using that same formula, that means they're predicting that over the next 2 centuries, the rate of economic growth will decline because of global warming by 0.14% per annum. Now, when you look at, have you ever seen any numbers coming up for economists hypothesising what the rate of growth is going to be, or reporting recorded changes in GDP? The accuracy is 0.1. Okay? So this is slightly more than the minimum accuracy with which they can measure changes in GDP today. That's what they say is going to be the impact of 7 degrees of global warming. Now, if you read the scientists on this front, this is one of my favourite papers in science literature, and it says that they reclassified they broke down the classification of dangerous climate change into 3 more. I said 1.5 degrees is dangerous, we're already there, as you're probably aware. 3 degrees is catastrophic, and more than 5 is unknown, including effectively existential risks. That's what the scientists are saying. The complete disconnect. One bunch says tiny fall in the rate of economic growth, the other said we won't exist anymore. There's a slight difference in accuracy, as you can tell. Now, you would think that don't economists read climate scientists, and they do. And I, in fact, I became aware of Tim Lenton's work by reading Nordhaus. So here is Tim Lenton saying in 2008, reporting on a survey of climate scientists about tipping points, saying a variety could reach a critical point within this century. The greatest threats are the Arctic and Greenland, the ice sheet, and at least 5 others could surprise us by giving a nearby tipping point. Now, I first became aware of that by reading the manual for William Nordhaus's so-called integrated assessment model, DICE. And he wrote in that there have been a few systematic surveys of tipping points. A particularly interesting one is by Lenton. Finds no critical elements within 300 years and less than 3 degrees of warming. Okay? And then he followed up in what are called the climate casino. That was in the climate casino, a book. In the manual itself, this is where I first realised that Tim Lenton actually existed. And he said the model assumes that damages are a quadratic function of temperature and does not include sharp tipping points or thresholds, but this is consistent with a survey by Lenton. Well, as soon as I thought that, I thought, hang on a second, I can't believe that a climate scientist thinks that makes sense. Go and find the paper. It wasn't actually in the bibliography. I had to go searching to find it. And it's utterly contradictory. A false sense of security by smooth projections of tipping points. We assume damages are quadratic and they don't have any tipping points. Okay? A variety could reach their tipping point within this century. No critical elements with a time horizon of less than 300 years. Okay? And finally, you just look at it and say consistent, my ass, okay? If high school students, actually probably if primary school students, submitted that as a summary of Lenton, I would fail them, okay? Now, instead of being failed, he got the Nobel Prize in economics. And that gives you an idea of what the Nobel Prize is worth. His work began with attacking the limits to growth. I assume in this room most people are aware of the limits to growth. And the predecessor to that was written by one of the world's great engineers, J. Forrester, a book called World Dynamics. And so the work was funded by the Club of Rome, but it wasn't actually done by them. It was done by engineers at MIT, not hippies at Woodstock. This is MIT engineers who did this work. And they used what's called system dynamics, and I've heard that mentioned favourably today already. And they made predictions about population. They had 5 system states: population, food production, industrialisation, pollution, and consumption of non-renewable resources. And those 5 system states were calibrated by extremely careful research with a bunch of field specialists over a 2-year period. So when you take a look and see what they did, this is the book which reports on that consultation with field experts. And this is the contents of that book. And you can see 170 pages worth of research into population, about 60 pages into capital, and so on and so forth. So a lot of very detailed work was done to set the model up. And they developed indices for each of those 5 system states and then ran the model until such time as it captured those index values from 1900 to 1970, and then they ran it forward to 2100. That's how the report was done. Now, it was published in 1972. That's the actual book. You can get a free copy. If you haven't read it, please download it and take a look at it. It will be seen as the most prophetic work of humanity, period. once we realised what the hell we're stuck in. And what it did, it explained the exponential function, and that's something that most humans don't understand, especially economists, because they work in equilibrium all the time. It then detailed how system dynamics works. It provided the basics of how they calibrated the model, not the entire huge book I showed beforehand, and then argued that exponential growth has limits. Isn't that a horrifying thought? It's heresy to economists. That's what got them to attack the limits to growth. And they ran 7 different scenarios, including increased resources and better technology and so on. And they found that only one scenario resulted in anything other than civilization collapse, sometime in the 21st century. Now, they were very careful when they put that together. They were deliberately vague about the timing. They actually explain why in the volume. So to avoid getting gotcha moments and being called out for making false predictions, which of course is all you'll hear from the climate change deniers. Yeah, they said this would happen on X date. This bunch did not. They literally, every axis started at 1900, finished at 2100, and had no intervening years. That was a deliberate decision by them in formatting the results. Now, just as a bit of an aside, if you want to take a look at the model and run it properly, one of my great supporters and colleagues, Tyrone Keynes, has ported that model across to the Ravel software that was mentioned earlier. And this is the model that was ridiculed by Nordhaus in a paper he called Measurement Without Data, okay? Putting down the whole idea. And the Economic Journal, which published it, now the EJ is published, I think, out of LSE. I'm not sure about that. Am I slapping LSE? I think it's LSE that publishes the Economic Journal. It might be Oxford, I'm not sure. But one of the UK's leading universities, it's one of the top 5 journals. And they did not publish Forrester's rebuttal of all the mistakes that Nordhaus made in attacking his model. So economists aren't aware that what was done was just completely invalid. Now, these are the predictions they made. The best known one is called business as usual, and I think you can tell that implies global collapse starting sometime in the 21st century. So if you look down at this is where everything starts turning around. I've dropped the box at the point where food production per capita maximises and then starts to fall. If food per capita falls, especially heading towards zero, goodbye humanity, okay? That's the sort of prediction that was being made. They did one which they called the stabilised world, and they had to play around like crazy to reset the parameters and reset the assumptions to get to the point where everything continued on fine. If we took drastic action starting in 1975, half a century ago, okay? And you notice food per capita there continues rising, stabilises fundamentally, nobody starves to death in that format. Now, in looking at that, that was truly drastic changes necessary, none of which are likely to have been achievable. It's jigging the model to make the model give you a sustainable result. So they had population stabilisation in 1975, meaning we'd have about 3 billion humans now, not 8. Resource consumption dropped by 1/4, which is just undoable, but you can imagine a determined effort to try to reduce resource use per unit of GDP might have gotten there over time. More services, pollution 1/4 of the 1970 value. High, and this I'm emphasising this because this is the critical thing we're likely to experience now, courtesy of economists. High value on food production, diverting capital to food production, whether or not it's profitable. Okay? You simply have to have food. Okay? Now, you can't turn a profit if everybody's going to starve to death, and then making soil last longer and so on. Now, those restrictions are what enraged economists when they saw that this has to go, was the attitude. And Nordhaus sprung to the defence not of the humanity, not of the economy, but neoclassical economics, the theory that dominates universities today. So he ridiculed the study and he said, measurement without data, not a single relationship is drawn from actual data empirical studies. And that was massively false, but he could get away with it because the background report was published after the initial report came out. And he then, effectively he was like a cuckoo. Okay? We had a beautiful egg from a bald eagle, and he replaced it with, I don't know, maybe an Indian miner might be the appropriate animal instead. So he got rid of the good idea and put in this crazy Ramsey growth model that dominates all neoclassical models today. And he replaced the extremely careful calibration that the Limits to Growth study had done with his hunch. Now, I have never seen the word hunch in an academic article before. You don't put hunches in academic journals, okay? That's how crappy his work was at the time. But it established a research position, and hey, you can get papers published. Who knew? So it started off with him doing it on his own. Now there's about 2,200 of these idiots savant, and that's what they are, publishing papers in the so-called top 25 journals. And it's completely disengaged from what scientists are giving us. So this is economists versus scientists on a few occasions. And here's Nordhaus summarising his model after he got the Nobel Prize. 2.1% fall at 3 degrees of warming and 8.5 at 6 degrees of warming. Remember, 5 degrees catastrophic, we don't exist anymore. Maybe that's the GDP of lizards. It might be the only survivors. Scientists, that comment I've made beforehand, that's the gap between the economists and the scientists. And it gets on. This is a paper on tipping points, and I just couldn't believe when this was published. So I wrote a joint rebuttal to it with a number of climate scientists. Tipping points. This is, if we lost summer sea ice in the Arctic, Greenland, the West Antarctic ice shelf, Amazon, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the Indian monsoon, ocean methane hydrates, and permafrost, that would cause a 1.4% fall in GDP. You could see the planet was different from outer bloody space, but economists reckon the economy would sail through unaffected. So we just had to go at this and attack them. But you know, their capacity to understand this is just bizarre. So they came back and in their letter said, they say that our conclusions don't make sense, seemingly taken as given that damages will be larger than our estimates. For Christ's sake, 1.4% is just slightly different to zero. So yes, we do assume the damages will be larger, but that's the sort of mentality that dominates the economists this way. Then talking about the thermohighland circulation, which is the AMOC, you might know, think of it, the Gulf Stream. If that breaks down, according to a neoclassical economist, probably my favourite neoclassical economist to low, the guy called Richard Toll, he said that would improve GDP. Okay? Now, according to the scientists, that would be a critical challenge to food security, a 70% fall in the capacity to produce grain crops, fundamentally. This is, again, totally disconnected from reality. Now, they've fitted their numbers, and I'm just going to go this fairly quickly because we want to get to the discussion afterwards. They've used a number of methods, so-called, to make up the data, which they fit their numbers. So this is Nordhaus's first time doing what he calls the enumerative method, and they look at and add up, they take damages from science papers and add them up, and that sounds reasonable, until you see that he assumed 3% of the economy was largely exposed, 10% moderately, and 87% of the economy would be negligibly affected by climate change. Now, how does he get that result? These are the industries: manufacturing, mining, okay? All utilities, finance, trade, etc., difficult to find major impacts over the next 1.5 to 3/4 of a century. This is his table. And I'm focusing on what he called the negligible elements down here. All those things, they're not going to be affected. That's his assumption. Basically, he's equating climate change, climate to the weather, same basic thing. Now, the only thing they've got in common is they happen under cover. And somebody must have pointed out to the idiot, and he is an idiot, he's not unintelligent, but he's an idiot savant, William, there is open cut mining, that's exposed to the weather. So he changed his numbers to 85%, knocked off 2% for open cut mining. Now, it's stupid. There's no other way to describe this stuff. It should not be taken seriously. For example, even if it was true that being undercover would protect you from climate change, factories have to use roads to move goods between each other to produce output. So far, last time I checked, roads were not under roofs. Okay? But he assumed road, rail and rail transport, air transport would not be affected. This is so sloppy. Okay? You need inputs from nature. He left those out completely. Now, they have, and this comes from the whole way in which economists pretend to handle production. They have what's called a Cobb-Douglas production function, where you produce output by combining what they call technology, which is disembodied, there's no substance to it, labour and capital. Now, in the real world, you can't produce anything without inputs from nature. And this is a little saying that I came up with that led to me working out how to incorporate energy properly in production methods. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. If you don't have energy inputs, you don't have any output, and that's completely missed by neoclassical models. So what they've done is they've mistaken their blackboard for the real world, or their whiteboard. as it happens. And they've also mistaken the weather for climate. So this is a problem, in fact, which comes out of how we define it, because if you take a look at NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which last time I checked still existed. It may have been shut down by the time we leave the room, given how fast Trump moves. That says that weather's what you see on a daily basis, climate's the average over time. Now that obscures the structural changes that happen because of climate change. So the most extreme prediction I've seen in the literature by somebody with a credible background, though he's not necessarily credible on the actual circulation cells, argued that if we have an increase in the level of carbon dioxide to 500 parts per million, we're 70 parts per million from there already. At the rate we're going to get there in about 10 to 15 years. We're going to get this shift, the climate, from what is currently the Sahara weather will occur in southern Europe, up to about, well, north of Paris. So basically, if you want to go sandstorming, you can go to Paris in 10 years' time. But a bifurcation which could occur in the climate that meant that there'd be rainfall at the equator, rainfall at the poles, drought in between, except for catastrophic storms. That's the sort of life we'd have in where we live in the planet. And James Anderson is the person who discovered the hole in the ozone layer. He's professor of chemistry at Harvard, so somebody you shouldn't take seriously. And he said that with that's another 70 points, we're going to get changes in the strata, rather than just losing ozone over Antarctica, which only, it's only going to hurt penguins, so who cares? This is everybody. Okay, 2 orders of magnitude decline in the protection we have from the ozone layer from ultraviolet. And that would mean basically you couldn't go outdoors during daylight hours. Okay, forget it.
When would that be like?
Huh?
When would that be like?
70 parts per million, so I'd say at the current rate, about 15 years. Okay? This is the sort of stuff we're toying with. This is the structural stuff, which sometimes even scientists don't properly talk about the structural change we're going to see. They just give us temperature change. Okay. And there's other ones like the collapse of the AMOC. If the AMOC does collapse, then the average temperature of Europe will fall by 10 degrees, which means we'll start getting glaciers in northern Europe, and God knows what happens after that starts occurring. But basically we'll have to, there'll be European migrants trying to go to Africa. I'm sure they'll be welcomed with open arms, given what we've done to them. Wet bulb temperature as well. We now have predictions it's 31 degrees, not 35 degrees, which means far more people will be affected by it. This is what you can see in the science literature. So economists think they can use temperature across space to predict what's going to happen with global warming. So have a look at this. I mean, this is when I virtually broke down when I read this in a paper by Toll. They assumed that a variation of economic activity with climate over space holds over time as well. Now, as soon as you've made that assumption, you've rejected that climate change can matter because, Alaska's -5 and Florida's +35. That's 40 degrees Celsius range. We're only talking 5 or 10 degrees. Who cares? Now, you think I'm making that up, but I'm not. That's what they've actually done. So this is Richard Toll having a debate on Twitter with Daniel Swain, who's a climate scientist, and making these arguments here that people thrive in very different climates, so climate doesn't really matter. And if a relationship doesn't hold across space, it's very hard for you to argue that it holds across time, which is a complete misunderstanding of the mathematics of what I could call the ergodic systems. So I'm, just for the heck of it, in about an hour's time I earned myself a Nobel Prize by doing that same estimate and getting an estimate of the damages using data on American states in terms of temperature and state output, and I got a more extreme prediction than Nordhaus made out of that particular work. That's about as sophisticated as they are. So first of all, it's not true that space and time are equivalent. Einstein would like to know that, if that was a real statement. And secondly, even if you did think you could do this way, the incomes of regions across space are not independent. Florida earns money from Alaska. Alaska earns money from Florida. Cold regions can trade with hot regions now. A future hot Earth can't trade with today's cold Earth. They made no attempt to adjust their numbers on that obvious data cleaning that they should have done. And this is recent work by some economists from Cambridge, where they said that taking temperature relationships and GDP relationships across space now, they then forecast those forward. So here's the range of predictions made by other economists. They simply extrapolated forward as if we could continue in that direction, not changing that nonlinear relationship across a temperature range of 3.2 degrees Celsius, where of course we're going to have so many other elements of the climate. So, and the most extreme prediction made before the one I mentioned earlier, that one there, they assume again that what applies now and that today is going to apply in the future, despite radically changing the nature of the climate. And their damage functions, which is the way they supposedly measure how much of a fall in GDP can affect, is y equals x squared times a small constant. That's literally their damage function. They've been criticised from top to bottom by a range of conventional economists, but despite that, they continue doing exactly the same garbage today. You talk about talking to a brick wall. You get as much change in their procedure by criticising them as you do by having a conversation with a brick wall. And they then, to find out what's going to happen, they'll ask another economist what they think. So Nordhaus did a so-called expert survey. 10 of them were economists, 8 of them were people he said who weren't specialists in climate change, and one of them was Larry Summers. Okay? Now, I'm sure this is Larry Summers' comment. The existence of value of species is irrelevant. I don't care about ants except for drugs. Thanks, Larry. And then the degree of adaptability is so high that the impact will be basically zero. That's what's been pumped in. They asked 3 scientists as well. One refused to even answer the question, saying how crazy it was to even believe that you could use simply global temperature as an indicator of what's going to happen to economies over time. But the other 2, their numbers are 20 to 30 times the scale of the economists. Now, Nordhaus wrote, this is one of the interesting research topics. Do you think he's done the research? No. He hasn't asked scientists independently what they think. So I've got a lot of detail on this in a range of reports which are freely available, and my worry is that we're going to see the breakdown of our climate, not in the end of this century, not in centuries hence, but maybe in it's decades, if we're lucky, decades away. So this is one of the most recent overall comment reports saying we're on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. It's a global emergency. Much of the life on the planet is imperiled. And according to economists, that's worth about 0.5% of GDP. Now the question is, why do they do it? Why do they produce this shit? Okay, that's all it is. It doesn't deserve any respect at all. Because what they're seeing is this is a threat to the way they think about the economy. They believe the market can handle everything. Now, if you say climate change is huge, well, the market can't handle that. So they just made up numbers to defend their beliefs. And the work is completely cavalier. They've now got an incredibly detailed statistical analysis, but none of them challenge the underlying assumptions that you can use space as a proxy for time. And the trouble is, policymakers have taken them seriously, journalists the same. This is Stuart Kirk from the Financial Times, who a year ago mentioned that the worst case scenario is to lose 5%. And they said, but in the meantime, we're going to grow a lot, we're going to be so much richer. If you lose 5%, who cares? Now, that's what's informed our policymakers. That's why we've done bugger all to address climate change. They have no idea how bad this work is, and of course I'm trying to alert them to it. So, in the level of delusion, you simply have to see it to believe it. This is a bit more of that debate between Daniel Swain, myself interjecting, and Toll. And at one stage, Daniel says, we just don't know if we can survive a 10-degree warmer world. And he says, oh, that's why we invented air conditioning. That's a sophisticated riposte. Yeah? So what do we face? Well, this is the latest Global Tipping Points report. It says we expect irreversible change at much lower temperatures than the original estimates were made. So for the Greenland ice sheet, used to think it was 1 degree, now it's 0.8, we've already exceeded that. West Antarctic, they thought it was 3 to 5 degrees, now it's 1. So all these elements are likely to trip much faster than people realise. And probably the most dangerous for Europe being the AMOC collapsing, which would cause a local ice age here, and an increase in the southern hemisphere. So that's the scariest one. And Europe could actually become uninhabitable courtesy of this. Again, science research say this. The most recent paper I've seen said the rate of change, if this gets triggered, could be 3 degrees per decade, decline in temperature. Now, we're currently dealing with 0.2 to 0.36 increase. That's 10 times as fast in the opposite direction. There's just no way we can cope with that. Okay? Europe would have to be abandoned if that occurs. And geoengineering, therefore, is the only solution. We're doing it accidentally for 250 years. Now we've got to go in the opposite direction, but of course there can be unintended consequences. But if the alternative was you go extinct, what do? Okay, you have to do something. So I think all the stuff I've seen has been dangerous in various ways. MEER is the least dangerous proposal I've seen, which is why I'm a fan of the whole idea. And of course, you've already had this from Matteo, so I don't need to go through the details any further. But the most likely thing which is going to happen, I think, is most likely sulfur dioxide seeding. As soon as you get a huge wilt event or a fatal drought in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or some of the countries which can actually do this, it's going to happen. We're going to get rogue geoengineering. So the sooner we can do something which fits together with humanity in general, the better. And on that basis, we need rationing, we need income redistribution from the rich to the poor. And it's a currency proposal I like called EcoCore. I'm racing through here to get to the end. But we need to do something of this nature. And the countries which are most dangerous, most susceptible, are those which don't produce their own food, and that desperately includes the UK. Okay? You import more than 40% of the food you eat in this country. And so we're going to get armed conflict out of that. We're already seeing armed conflict, which you can put on that basis. So we need a new, realistic approach. I'm trying to develop it. This is my most recent published book, and I publish on Substack and Patreon as well. All my posts there are bar ones which have copyright or free access, but of course I appreciate support for it. I'm giving an online course as well. It's got dreadfully intimidating marketing. It doesn't sound like you're going to get anything like me at all, but you do at the end. So my apologies for the marketing, and support me. Thank you.